This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 264. Why No Marxist Revolution?
Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie, and today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen, for all Karl Marxists talk about a revolution, and there are Marxists still waiting for that time, well, there hasn't really been one, has there? Revolutions that have happened weren't really as Marx prescribed, but maybe what he advocated for has changed anyway. But could we be engineering a situation where a Marxist-style revolution could be on the cards anyway? Not that we advocate revolutions, of course, because as the Beatles sang all those years ago, when it comes to destruction, don't you know you can count me out? Besides, everything's going to be all right. Is it? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So Marx believed that the power play between the capitalists and the workers would create a class conflict that would ultimately end in a revolution. So, Steve, I mean, the inevitable revolution, wasn't it? Because the bourgeois were making money off the surplus labour of the workers, and people would see the injustice in that. In fact, in the last paragraph of the manifesto of the Communist Party, he wrote, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletariats have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." Now, to an extent we had that, didn't we? Because we had the union movement. But it was decried by many, and of course, it's basically died in this country. The revolution we've seen, if anything, has actually been in the bourgeois, the capitalists having even more influence in a position to take even more of that surplus labour, if indeed that is the problem. But also, of course, they're making money out of having money as well. So the revolution has not happened in terms of the workers rising. The revolution has happened in terms of the rich basically making themselves richer.
Well, I mean, I always try to put Marx in the context of what it would have been like to be in England in the 1840s to 1860s. Which is when he did most of his writing. 1844 is when he started getting into economics, and that was in Paris. And not long after that, he was evicted from France. He says he's evicted from Prussia, and ended up in the UK, where the libertarian, in that sense, the liberal politics of the UK relative to Prussia, which was quite proto-fascist in some ways, and France, which was remnants of Napoleon. He got a chance to practice uninhibited for all that time. But what was it like at the time? Well, one thing that Marx and Jenny did Karl Marx and Jenny Marx did at some stage was move out of Chelsea because of a cholera epidemic. Now, I know things aren't particularly sanitary there at the moment, most of the best of times, but you don't get cholera anymore. So if you want to think about...
No, certainly not in Chelsea.
Not in Chelsea, no. Yeah. Thank God they got to those nasty Marxes. They probably improved everything. But yeah, it was... Fundamentally, my picture of England then would be like India 30 or 40 years ago. When you read the book The Suitable Boy, that walking through vast areas where tanning is occurring and the chemicals of tanning are being breathed by people who are working in the tanning factories and often sleeping there. The conditions were absolutely appalling. And what Marx saw as a revolution was getting away from that. But he also, a large part of what he saw as a revolution, we'd call the welfare state these days. It was, universal education, universal healthcare, etc., etc. And even
so, we've had it in a way. We've had it then. What he predicted has happened. Because people talk about Marx and they talk about violent revolution. He never really advocated that, did he?
No, he was fundamentally he wanted democracy because at the same time to be able to vote at the time you had to be a landowner or you had to be a merchant. The access to the vote when Marx was writing was based on if you're a landlord or a capitalist you could vote. Forget about it if you're working class. So a lot of what Marx called revolution then we'd call, looking back on it, we'd call democratic reform. And if you read the whole Communist Manifesto as well, a large part of it is a pay into capitalism. It's saying how capitalism has transformed society, and previous social classes were all about maintaining an existing situation. Capitalism and the bourgeoisie are about transforming production, and Marx saw that as a very creative role for capitalism. But what he got wrong, and this is what I focus on, is that his basic principle in the Communist Manifesto and in all his technical writing as well was that capitalism would divide the world into two classes. There'd be proletariat and bourgeoisie. You'd have a tiny proportion who had wealth and lived off the labour of the majority, and the majority you wouldn't have doctors and nurses and so on. You'd have everybody be reduced to a wage slave. Now, what that got completely wrong was the enormous growth in the middle class, because the apparatus of capitalism, at least for the last 1.5 centuries, has been massively dependent upon a growth of a bureaucracy, both the government bureaucracy, of course, but also bureaucracies inside corporations, which are far larger than the neoclassical myth of perfect competition, and far larger than Marx had in mind as well. And the bureaucracy to run that, rather than getting a division into two social classes, you had an enormous growth of a third social class that wasn't even on Marx's radar, and that was the middle class.
So, but still, this idea of surplus labour, I mean, that was key to it as far as he was concerned. And I wonder whether. So, you look at the union movement, for example. Was the strength of the union movement really about, well, we want to get some more of that of that money which is generated by this surplus labour? Or was it more about, well, we just want better conditions because we've been living in bad conditions? Sure, we may want a bit more pay. But I mean, there's a recognition, isn't there, that, if you've invested in a business, you've got to get some return. You're the one taking the risk. So the money's got to come from somewhere. And that is going to be workers working harder than you're going to pay them for, in effect.
Well, that's what Marx thought. And if you look, just a bit of background here. When I became an academic was back in 1987, and I started doing a master's degree at the University of New South Wales. And what I wanted to do in that master's was to take a look at where the labour theory of value came from. Because back when I was an undergraduate student, back at Sydney University in 1973, we did a reading of Das Kapital. This is typical thing a bunch of lefties do in the middle of a Sydney summer, is sit in a darkened room in this main quadrangle of Sydney University, collectively reading every chapter in Das Kapital, Volume 1. And
while everyone else was down at the beach with the girls.
At the beach, yeah. I mean, I occasionally hit the beach again. Didn't hit the girls that early, but anyway, I hit the beach every now and then. In reading it, I was sceptical about the labour theory of value, because what the labour theory of value says, apart from saying that, capitalists exploit labour, it was saying that machines provide no net surplus. Machines simply give to production what it costs to make them. And I just couldn't swallow that. And I remember walking across the campus one day with another young lefty lawyer, and we could see all these kangaroo cranes on the buildings in Sydney, because there's a huge building boom going on at the time. I said, I want a really good explanation by Marx as to why those machines aren't adding value. Well, what Marx argued was that before he wrote Capital, he argued that capitalists buy things at their cost of production and sell them at their cost of production. So you buy something what it costs to make it, and you sell it what it costs to make it. So how do you make a profit? And his answer was that when you buy an ordinary commodity, you pay its cost of production, and you get utility from whatever if you bought an apple, you pay its cost of production, you get the utility of eating an apple. So with a worker, you pay its cost of production, and the cost of production are the means of subsistence. You've got to pay a worker enough money that they can buy what's necessary to stay alive for that day. But he said the working day, let's say, takes 6 hours to make what's necessary to keep a worker alive for a full day, or a worker and worker's family. He said that working day can be 12 hours. So the first 6 hours reproduce the cost, and then the next 6 hours are a surplus that accrues to the employer just because they have the employment contract, and that's
so
where profit comes from.
Sweating the assets, isn't it? Really, except the assets are human beings rather than pieces of machinery.
Yeah, well, but he said that doesn't apply to a machine. So if a machine takes 1,000 hours to make, then it will give 1,000 hours worth of output to the production, but it won't produce any surplus, because there's this distinction between labour and labour power, which didn't apply to any other commodity. Now,
but his argument would be, though, wouldn't it, that those machines still need people to operate them. So those cranes still have crane drivers, for example. It's just that the crane driver is getting more results because he's got a crane to help him.
Yeah, but it never made sense. It didn't make sense to me that the machine didn't contribute anything. And when in reading Capital, at the same time, of course, I was revolting against the neoclassical idea about utility maximization and all the subjective theory of value that neoclassicals have. So neoclassical will talk about marginal cost and marginal utility, blah, 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 and I'd already rejected that by the time we started reading Marx. But in the first 7 chapters of Capital, Marx starts talking about use value and exchange value. And what he argued was that in a capitalist economy, what matters, what dominates the society, is the exchange value. You make something because you can sell it, not because you want to use it. So the use value of something goes into the background. The foreground of interest in a capitalist system is the exchange value. Use value goes into the background. You said normally that ends up just being something that you pay for the cost of making a chair. The satisfaction, what you get out of the chair is the fact that you can sit in it. There's no link between the two; they're incommensurable. And when he applied that to labour, he said, well, when you hire a worker, you pay their exchange value, which is their cost of production, which is the means of subsistence. What you get is their use value, which is their capacity to do work for you. They're incommensurable, but this time around they're both quantitative. One might be 6 hours of labour to make the exchange value. They work for you for 12 hours. That's how you make your profit. And I thought, brilliant argument, absolutely love it, and exactly the same argument applies to machines. The machine costs 1,000 hours of labour to make. It might put the equivalent of 2,000 or 3,000 hours of labour in, and the gap between is a profit. You can make a profit out of both. Now, Marx himself realised this when he first came up with the use value, exchange value stuff, but he buried it in stuff that made it look like the whole labour, the idea that it was these unique characteristics of labour that explained why it can make a profit. And that was... His new development was right. His old one was wrong, and I think that's really, to me, that's the source of why there was never a socialist revolution.
Right. Okay, so we finished the podcast there. Except, but
I've got to explain why. You got to ask why now.
I know. Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, okay, I will. But also, just going off at a tangent, your idea of this exchange value. I know how much you hate neoclassic economists, but this is one thing I've always struggled with. The cost of producing something is not what it's worth. And look, I know from a career in marketing that you basically charge what you can get away with, and you increase your margins by improving the brand, so you make it more desirable. And every good is sold that way. So in fact, what you're selling it for is not necessarily related to the cost of producing it.
Oh, it's a markup on the cost of production. And this is the whole, when people do break-even analysis. I mean, what made spreadsheets such a popular technology was that small business people do break-even analysis and say, after so many units have been sold, we're going to make a profit, and the more units, the more profit we make, and that's the real world. And Marx's use value, exchange value stuff applies to that real world, and what it shows is there's no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Now, a huge part of Marx's argument about a socialist revolution was that, first of all, he starts from what he'd actually disproved himself, but he starts from the idea that labour is the only source of what he calls value, and then value is what determines price. So you have surplus value coming out of labour, but not coming out of machinery. Then you saw a tendency for technological change over time to mean you use more machinery relative to labour as time goes on. If you start from the point of view that labour is the only source of profit, and you're adding more machinery than you are labour over time, then your rate of profit is going to fall. And he gave a number of what he called countervailing tendencies to slow down how fast that would happen. But fundamentally, the idea that the rate of profit would fall was what would motivate the capitalists to treat the workers even worse, try to squeeze them more, make more money out of them, etc., etc. This would cause the sort of antagonism between the classes, and that would lead to the revolution. Now, Marx's own logic, is what my very first paper was on, why the labour theory of value was false, using Marx's own logic. And when you say that it's false, and profit can come out of machinery inputs and raw material inputs as well as just labour, there's no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So that factor that Marx thought would motivate a revolution doesn't happen.
And this idea that we've got, a much better standards now. We're not when we look at, for example, how mobile phones are made. So, for example, and there's obviously machinery involved in that process, but there's also quite a bit of labour that we've outsourced to China. Interestingly, a country that supposedly has been through a communist revolution, where people have been working in sweatshops making clothes and making phones and everything else that we're demanding in the West with very bad conditions. And they must be looking at the cost that those phones and clothing, what they're sold for, and thinking, hang on, we're not getting a fair deal here. They wouldn't actually be thinking about the investment in machinery alongside in the process. They'd just be looking and saying, well, look, this is going for 20 times our wage. And there's nowhere in the world we can afford this. You would have thought that would prompt a revolution, except perhaps they're in a country where that's not quite so easy, because they've already had one.
Yeah, well, that's that's legitimate. That's the sort of thing which does lead to people wanting to overthrow capitalism. But the fundamental driving factor that Marx thought would be behind it wasn't there. You didn't have a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. What you did have over time was an enormous increase in the productive surplus of the whole society, which workers and capitalists effectively were fighting over who got what. But it wasn't declining, so that you had them sort of, it wasn't.
So the situation wasn't getting worse for them. There's less tendency for a revolution if everyone feels as though they're progressively getting better off.
If the ceiling is coming down, you're going to be fighting about who gets out of the house first. If the ceiling is rising, which is what actually was happening because of the physical productivity of capitalism, which came out of exploiting all the energy that we liberated from fossil fuels and the technology to do that and so on, that improvement meant general standards rose for most people over a substantial period of time, and managing that required a huge bureaucracy. So people would, you might have a factory worker as a father and mother and father, and then you yourself become a bureaucrat inside a corporation or inside the government, and your situation is actually better. So the pressure for revolution that Marx thought would come didn't happen in the most advanced countries, which is where he thought it would first occur. It happened in the most backward, which was Russia.
Yeah, and that was the situation where you had the Bolsheviks, who were basically workers who were, they weren't even employed, were they? It was slavery, it was serfdom, working for the landowners directly. So a completely different situation, because it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that you had no freedom whatsoever that prompted the Russian Revolution. And again, the revolution in China, different circumstances as well, wasn't it, really? Because it was more about the country pulling together after being invaded by Japan.
Well, it was also the power of landlords. So what you had was the sort of feudal power structures that led to revolution in the context of a capitalist global system. And then one of the best plays I've ever seen was a play called Fan Shen, which is apparently Chinese for transform. And it explained how the communists managed to take over China, not just in terms of the military stuff, but the ideology as well. And part of the whole process was they'd lock a village. Once they invaded and driven the Kuomintang out of a village, they'd have a meeting, and the point of the meeting was people had to answer a question, and the question was, who depends on whom for a living? And without fail, people would start saying, well, I depend upon the landlord, because if the landlord didn't give me land to work, then I couldn't make food for my family. But they finally would realise that, hang on a sec, the landlord's only surviving because we all did the work for him, and that fat bastard sits in his wealthy house counting the money. If we didn't work, he wouldn't have anything, and then the people themselves would overthrow the landlord. But it was the feudal structures that revolution overthrew rather than the capitalist ones. And when you look at England and look at America in particular, yes, there were appalling periods of behaviour by the capitalists there, and there still are, but fundamentally that was on the basis of a growing amount of wealth, a growing amount of physical resources being split and campaigning over the two. And in some ways, the capitalists have gone too far by, effectively wiping out the capacity of unions to bargain in the other direction. But they could do it because the general standard of living was rising at the same time, not falling, as Marx thought it would be for the proletariat.
But aren't we also going back to the position where, the rich are the landowners and everybody else is working for them, in that, we got over that problem because, for most of the last century, people believed they could own their own home. I don't think kids believe that anymore because homes have become so expensive. The only people who can afford it are the people who've already got a house. They can perhaps buy another one.
Yeah, well, but that's more the finance sector causing a breakdown than the sort of physical forces of production that Marx thought would lead to a revolution in the most advanced capitalist nations. But
we are getting back to a situation, aren't we, where it's sort of people who own the land and people who just work.
Yeah, and that's funnily enough, some of the best stuff in Marx is not in Capital Volume 1, it's in Capital Volume 3, where he talks about what he calls the roving cavaliers of credit and blames them for causing breakdowns in the productive system. And there he was spot on, and he's still spot on. So it's the finance sector that has jeopardised the survival of capitalism by driving up the price of housing and driving up the value of assets and amplifying the inequality that was there in the basic capitalist system to begin with and making it more unsustainable in the long run.
So when Marx basically split the world into two, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and he didn't have a middle class. I mean, there must have been a middle class. There must have been doctors and surgeons and sort of some sort of managerial class that was sitting in the middle. So how did he account for them? Which side of the fence did they? Yeah.
He got it wrong. I mean, he basically thought he not so much ignore them. He thought they would disappear over time. He thought that all doctors would end up working as employees in a hospital rather than being self-employed. Now, of course, that's happened in America, ironically enough. But just in the other extreme, you've got them working for the state in the UK. But generally speaking, that the middle class are people who either were what Marx would call petty bourgeoisie, so they had their own capacity to create income out of their skills, or shopkeepers as well. That didn't disappear, that expanded, and particularly people who earned a decent standard of living working as a clerical assistant in the huge enterprises of capitalist firms. He thought they'd get less income over time. In fact, because they were in a hierarchy above the workers, they got more money, and because that's rather than going 5% capitalist, 90% worker and 5% middle class, you had the 90% workers going down to 30% workers and the 5% middle class going up to of the order of 60% of the population. And that growth in the middle class meant that for the vast majority of people in an advanced capitalist nation like Australia, Europe, the UK, America, they saw rising standards of living, and they got, through political campaigning within the existing structure, they got a lot of the things which Marx thought would come through revolution anyway. Things like universal health, public education, and the right to vote.
Yeah, let's hope we can keep paying for those things, because we are seeing, aren't we, that wealth is continuing to accumulate in the hands of a few, and particularly with technology. So you look at the bigger companies that are employing fewer people. So shops, in the UK, how many high street chain stores that were employing people have disappeared because everyone's buying stuff from Amazon, which is largely automated, employing very few people. So the wealth of Bezos and others who are the top tier of these companies is surpassing the accumulated expense of so many people who were working in shops before. So I wonder whether we're sort of tilting back to where we were. Okay,
and that's feasible. I think because particularly because we've gone so far past the limits that the planet can cope with. At some stage, we are going to see the miserization that Marx thought would happen in a social way. We're going to see that in ecological immiserization, and then you could get And then can people say, well, why have we got here? It's because of the rapaciousness of capitalism. It isn't because capitalism battened on the working class, which is what Marx thought would happen. It's rapacious exploitation of the resources of the planet, leading to a breakdown in the productive system. And then in that circumstance, then we're likely to get, if not socialism, something much less based on market freedom and a much more constrained political system.
Well, not just market freedom as well, in that, I mean, this might be a bad example, but it's a realization of how much we've given our lives over to capitalism. So, the olden days, you worked down a coal mine, you still had your family and friends, you went to the pub and had a chat with them or sat around the dinner table. Now we do a lot of that over Facebook. So while we're doing that, we're being advertised at. I lost my Facebook account after 15 years of interactions because my account was hacked. And a private company wouldn't let me get access back to those interactions. So interactions of people I've had, many of them no longer alive, like my dad, for example, all because my account was hacked. And so I don't have a great feeling towards Facebook. It was a warning to me that so much of my life I'd given over to a private company. And how much freedom do we have these days? Because we are, so much of what we're doing is being commercialized. It's not as simple as those days when you'd finish down the coal mine and go and have a chat with your friends and have a beer.
Yeah, and I think those sorts of changes mean that 1.5 centuries after Marx thought it would happen, we may well see a revolution becoming what people talk about. And there's certainly, I mean, you probably know more about this than I do in terms of the popularity of the word socialism, which is worrying so many conservatives in America now. I think people are looking and thinking, we're so excluded, the wealth is so extreme. The fact that you can name the wealthiest people on the planet these days, in a way, you see with the Rockefellers in the past, but they weren't media stars. So the inequality is being shoved in your face at the same time as you can't afford to go and buy a house.
I wouldn't call Jeff Bezos a media star either, mind you. But yeah, so I mean, it's the numbers tell it all. So the Institute of Fiscal Studies calculates that not exactly a left-wing think tank, quite the reverse, they've calculated that the top 1% of households take in 8% of all household income. This is in the UK. I think it's obviously worse in the United States. In 1961, they were taking in 3.5%. So they have more than doubled their share. But as we were saying before, we all feel it's not a problem for most people because even if we're poor, we probably have flat screen TVs and dishwashers, and we've obviously all got access to healthcare and education. We've probably got a smartphone. There have been much worse times to be poor. So maybe that's what's holding it back, because as you say, we're taking a small share, an increasingly small share of a rapidly expanding pie.
Yeah, and at the same time, there are technological changes that are meaning that some of what Marx thought would happen back 150 years ago is happening now. So if you wanted to manage a capitalist enterprise back in the 1800s, you needed to have an educated workforce that could write. And one of the reasons Marx didn't get a job was nobody could read his handwriting. So you needed an educated force, so you had to provide education for people in general if they're going to manage these corporations. You had the dramatic growth. Like we talk about the internet being a transformational technology. Well, consider electricity, for God's sake, going from oil-powered lights everywhere to electric power. My mother used to tell me a story of my father buying the first washing machine because he came upon Mum virtually asleep, hand-turning the crank to press the clothing out of the washing machine, and then Dad raving about the wonders of the machine when friends came over to take a look at the washing machine. This is back in the 1950s in Sydney. The transformation that harnessing energy and then electrifying to distribute the energy, then machines to do that, has taken a huge amount of the drudgery out of people's lives, which Marx thought would only get worse with time. And that's because, again, he was focusing upon, exploiting labour as the source of value. And in fact, what gives us the surplus is exploiting energy. And that tendency has meant that even the poorest people in the advanced nations have done a damn sight better over time rather than worse. So the immiserization Marx thought would happen back in the 1800s Didn't happen then, but it might well happen if we run out of energy in the 2100s.
And you could argue that innovation, that innovation which has made everyone's lives better, is because capitalists have seen a return on their investment. They've got the ability to take risk, and that has created innovation. If you had all the money taken by the workers, if there was no surplus that was left to go back to capitalists, then they wouldn't be rewarded for that risk. And so we might see less innovation.
I mean, you get people like it's quite possible for workers' cooperatives to end up with a fair bit of innovation. So the Mondragon cooperative movement in Spain is a classic example of workers taking over corporations and managing to innovate both in how they manage the corporations and the technology they produce. And it's been one of the fastest growing parts of the world economy for 30 or 40 years or 50 years. So it isn't a necessity that's the outcome of paying workers more or letting workers manage. But you've got to be investing and technologically advancing, and that's what we've been doing for 1.5 centuries. But my worry is we've gone well past what the planet itself can sustain, and then when we're forced to go backwards, then the sorts of revolutions Marx thought might happen in the 1800s may happen in the 2000s instead.
Well, cooperatives would be an interesting approach to that, wouldn't they, actually, if we had more companies that were cooperatives? And we've got a reasonable number. I mean, obviously, there's bugger all in Australia, but we've got a reasonable, and in America, but we've got a reasonable number in the UK. So, for example, John Lewis and that whole group is all a cooperative. But if we had, that removes the need for the profit motive. So look at what China's done, for example, now, just saying, well, look, you can provide technology to our education sector, you just can't make any money out of it. And that doesn't stop innovation, does it? That you can still operate as a company. What is driving the motivation for profit is to satisfy shareholders. So you've got investors in the company. But once you're over that hurdle, if you've had the capital to get the company started, and that can come from workers investing in it. There's no need for that profit motive if it's just you're keeping the operation going and innovating and improving.
Yeah, but you've still got to. A corporation can't print its own money, so it's still got to be taking in more than it gets back out again, and a large. Vast number of companies that get formed actually fail in their first 3 years. So this innovative side of capitalism is something that I think, again, Marx underrated and didn't see the dangers of a pure socialist system ending that capacity for innovation. And here, my favourite economist is János Kornai, who is a Hungarian economist. He's still alive and kicking. And he was trying to explain why did the socialist system grow more slowly than capitalism? Because again, as well a bleeding revolution would occur, the revolutionaries themselves believed they would grow faster than capitalism, and because they would remove all the contradictions of the class system, you'd end up with a socialism growing faster than capitalism. Well, that didn't happen at all. You had technological stagnation in the socialist economies, and Kornai tried to explain why with the idea of a very stylized model of an economy, saying, imagine that capitalism is all about maximum profit, minimum payment to the workers, and disaggregated industry. So you're going to have low wages, always a tendency towards low aggregate demand, but corporations who are trying to grab some of that for themselves versus their rivals will do it by innovation. They'll come up with new products. And that's the main source of competition in capitalism. On the other hand, if you have a socialist system where you try to give as high wages as possible, and you'll have single corporations in each industry, and each industry...
No reason to innovate.
No reason to innovate, and of course the classic. I mean, if you set a quantitative target for producing nails, I don't know if it's mythical or not, but the idea is that some company was given a target for producing so many tons of nails, so they made a couple of nails each weighing a ton. They fulfilled the plan, but you couldn't use the nails. And what Kornai said would happen is there'd be a tendency towards shortages in a socialist economy, because everybody deserved to get what they wanted for their productive process. Everybody got rationed, and with the rationing, it meant that you you couldn't produce your targets if you tried to innovate. Innovation necessarily involves waste. So you avoid the waste, and therefore you don't innovate. And I think I've told you this several times before. A 1973 Russian motorbike was a 1942 BMW. And that's quite literally. I've seen them. So capitalism leads to more innovation, and underplaying the innovation is what Marx got wrong in expecting a revolution to occur in the 1800s. But he may well be right in the 2000s, because that innovation was based on exploiting cheap energy, and we've exploited that far too much. And
so the pie is going to start shrinking. And
if the pie starts shrinking, then yeah.
That's when push comes to shove. I wonder whether we're getting there, because we've been through 30 years, haven't we? Well, in the 60s and the 70s, we protested. Kids don't protest anymore. Where is Bob Dylan singing "The Times They Are Changing"? Or where are all the protest songs that we all grew up with? There's very little. I mean, protests now are the woke brigade, protesting for gender fluidity. It's a very different game to protesting against capitalism, which is what we grew up with.
Yeah, I've got to read if you mentioned the Communist Manifesto at a start, and I highly recommend people to read that, because it's a great piece of writing. And some of the parts are wrong, some parts are very prescient. And I'm just looking at the part now that Marx got wrong. But he had a logic that said there'd be a growth in the proletariat, a decline in their incomes, they'd be more united, and that's why they'd lead to revolution. And this is the quote on page 63. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, and there he was wrong, it becomes concentrated in greater mass, its strength grows, it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks are more and more equalised, which is also wrong, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labour and nearly every reduces wages to the same low level, which wasn't happening until 1973. It maybe happened since then. The growing competition amongst the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises makes the wages of workers even more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, even more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeoisie take on more and more the character of collisions between two classes. So this division into two classes is what Marx saw happening back in the 1800s. He was dead wrong. Said it was a growth of a third class as well, and
right.
It's potentially becoming correct.
Yeah, well, and those jobs are disappearing because of machines. So the people are competing against machines, and their future is precarious. They're all on, not all, but lots of people on 0-hour contracts, all that sort of stuff. The reassurance they had of having a job for life has gone now.
And the technological stuff, which, that's where I think computing has been so important, because, back in the 1800s, you needed a clerk who could do double entry bookkeeping. Now you need a software package. And I worked in the software industry for a while, as you probably know. And I remember hearing a presentation by a total jerk, I must say, of a software package for managing general practitioner's business. And his main selling point was that rather than the doctor needing 6 secretaries, he can get rid of them all and do it himself for a few minutes. And that's removed that middle class layer. And we have seen over time that end of the spectrum, which expanded so much work in the 1800s up to the 1960s, 1970s, that's declining. So one of the factors that meant Marx was wrong, this expansion in the middle class, because their work was needed to manage the complexities of a capitalist institution, that's being wiped out by software. And yes, the two-class division Marx is talking about is happening now. But it wasn't happening 150 years ago.
Yeah, all right. Definitely time to go and revisit it. Good to talk, Steve. Look, we're going to look at the life after the pandemic, should that ever happen, next week. What's the world going to look like then? We'll do that next week. Good to talk.
Okay.
By the way, if you're listening to this on Patreon, did you know that you have your own, if you're a Patreon subscriber, that you get your own individual RSS feed, which you can cut and paste and put into your favourite podcast app. So you can listen to this not on the Patreon site, but on whichever podcast app you want. So go to the description that's alongside this podcast on Patreon if you want to see what that particular RSS is. Back again next week. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next week. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.